If you were to ask biblical scholar like Raymond Brown, what do you regard, Father Brown, as crucial differences between the two gospel birth stories, what do you think he'd say? He might lay out something to us like this. In Matthew's story, Joseph and Mary live in Bethlehem, and they have a house there. I never read that, right? Because you've watched a lot of movies, and you've prayed a lot of rosaries, and you've had a lot of devotions, and you've seen a lot of Christmas creches and pageants, and they've done the work for you. You don't have to read the story. Your mind just... So when you eventually did get to reading Matthew, if you ever did, chapter 1 and 2, you put a lot of your imagination, worked overtime, and put a lot of things there that weren't even there in the text. In Matthew, chapter 1 and 2, Joseph and Mary are from Bethlehem, folks. We're going to see this later on. They never go there. They never move there. They're originally from there. They live in a house. They stay in Bethlehem until the child is nearly 2 years old, Matthew 2:16, and the only reason they cannot go back to their hometown of Bethlehem after the flight into Egypt is their fear of Herod's son. And so consequently, they have to go to a city called Nazareth with the clear implication that they have never been there before. Oh yeah. Matthew chapter 2, verses 10 to 11. They were overjoyed at seeing the star, the Magi, and on entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother. They prostrated themselves and did him homage. Then they opened their treasures and offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. See, the Matthean infancy narrative describes Joseph and Mary as being natives to Bethlehem. When you have cultural auxiliary background information, you realize they would have to be there. They'd have to live there.
And the child was around 2 years old.
Right. They've lived there for 2 years. They've lived there their whole lives. And then once the child is born in subsequent 2 years, as any villager would be in their native place. And remember, Matthew's not writing thinking, well, it's okay if they don't know what, because I didn't bother to put in that they traveled from Nazareth. I'll let Luke do that. No, he doesn't know Luke's going to write anything.
Yeah.
They live in their house there. In Matthew, there is no manger.
Maybe there was a midwife also.
Oh, call the midwife. It's a great show. But here's the thing. Whether you call the midwife or don't call the midwife, that's not what... Which is fine. That's okay. There could be a midwife. I'm not going to knock that. But in Matthew, that's not what it's talking about. They're not talking about midwives. Yes.
And a couple with an infant child going rogue on their families.
Going rogue on their families? What do you mean?
Yeah, if they're from Bethlehem and they leave, they can't come back. Or they don't come back.
Right.
It's never just... There's no nuclear family, it's just 3.
Oh, that's right. They live in a household. It's a Middle Eastern family, so that's 50 to 100 people that live in that house.
Right.
All right, let's keep on moving. Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. Yes, Fina.
But I remember last year.
Yes.
When you said
I'm glad you do. It's me, it's gone.
About the cave.
The cave. Right, the cave. Well, we have to talk about that later, but that's a subsequent development and everything. We'll talk about what the cave possibly is. All right, Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. Good for you pointing that out. When Herod realized that Herod the Great, had been deceived by the Magi, he became furious. He ordered the massacre of all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had ascertained from the Magi. In other words, the family stays in Bethlehem until the child is nearly 2 years old. I want you to keep that detail in mind because we're about to read Luke in a little bit. Matthew chapter 2, verse 22 to 23. But when Joseph heard that Archelaus, the son of Herod, was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod the Great, he was afraid to go back there to his hometown. And because he had been warned in a dream, he departed for the region of Galilee. He went and dwelt in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene. Get the implication? They've never been to Nazareth before. According to Matthew, the family's real home is Bethlehem. The only reason they cannot go back to their real home, Bethlehem, after the flight into Egypt to escape Herod the Great is for fear of Herod's son doing the same thing. So, consequently, they go to a completely new place they've never been to before called Nazareth. In Luke, by the way, keep that, Lucy, because could that be the reason why Matthew puts it that way? He wants to, he's upset. Ooh, the Messiah and Cosmic Lord is from an embarrassing place. So let's make him come from the city of David first, right? That makes better sense, huh? In Luke, Mary and Joseph live in Nazareth. They go to Bethlehem only because of the census. By the way, is there a census in Matthew's story? No. And in Luke's story, Herod never wants to kill anybody. Herod isn't even a problem. After the birth of the child, having stopped in Jerusalem on the way, they go quickly back to Nazareth, and there they remain. Notice, they go to Jerusalem, where Herod the Great lives. They don't stay 2 years in Bethlehem. They just shoot back to home in Nazareth. Folks, this is not reconcilable. You cannot reconcile these two narratives. There is no reference to in Luke to the family being in Bethlehem for almost 2 years after the birth, or Bethlehem being their true home, to the coming of the Magi to Jerusalem and to Bethlehem with all the eclat that must have produced. Folks, I don't think you get it. The Magi come. Do you think they're just three guys coming? First of all, it doesn't say they're three guys. They would have a parade. It would be like an army is coming of servants and slaves with them. That's never been shown right in the movies. All of Jerusalem, it says, was talking about this. It's a huge mess. A hot mess they got on their hands. You don't think that there would be a public record of that somewhere?
Yeah, that's my question.
Only in Matthew. It's not mentioned at all in Luke. How could Luke miss that? If Luke thought that that's actually what happened. And why does Mark not mention this? Okay. So, no reference to the killing of children. By the way, we've never found remains of children that were murdered. And Luke doesn't even mention that. And Mark doesn't mention it. And John doesn't mention it. And Paul never mentions it. Only Matthew. So in Luke, there's no flight from Bethlehem into Egypt. That never happens. It's just they come from Nazareth because of the tax, right? The census, they go to Bethlehem. Then they got to present the child. They have no problem, no fear of Herod. They go right to Jerusalem. And then they shoot back in a very relative small space of time. In Matthew, they spend 2 years in Bethlehem. This is not reconcilable. Listen, folks, God can do a lot of things, but even God can't do this. He can't do absurdities. Okay, yes?
There were censuses back then, but none at that time of Jesus.
None worldwide. None worldwide, and right. Not at the time that Jesus, there was one later on. We're going to get to that. Thank you, Mary. Excellent staying on target there. So let's look at this. Luke chapter 1, 26 to 27. In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God to a town of Galilee called Nazareth. See, they're in Nazareth. To a virgin, a maiden, betrothed to a man named Joseph of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. Luke chapter 2, verse 4 to 5. And Joseph too went up from Galilee, from a town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David that is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family of David. They're not low lifes. They're not low life. Jesus is not a low life. He's from the house of David, to be enrolled with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. See, according to Luke, Mary and Joseph are natives to Nazareth, not Bethlehem. They both live there. It's their true home. They only travel to Bethlehem in Judah to be enrolled in the census. Luke chapter 2, verse 22. When the days were completed for their purification according to the law of Moses, they took Jesus up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. Verse 39, when they had fulfilled all the prescriptions of the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. According to Luke, after the birth of the child, they stop over in Jerusalem to present Jesus at the temple, with no threat that their baby boy is about to be killed by Herod, by the way. No, nothing about Egypt. Next, they go quickly and naturally back to Nazareth, their hometown, according to Luke, and there they remain. There's no trip to Egypt and no return from Egypt. I'm sorry, Anne Rice. Do your research work better.
And there is no dream either, right?
Right, exactly. That's in Matthew. So there we go. Examining Luke, no reference of the family being in Bethlehem for 2 years or more. No reference to the coming of the Magi. There's no Magi in Luke coming to Jerusalem and Bethlehem or anywhere. There's no reference to the slaughter of the innocents in Luke. These stories are not written by Americans. They weren't written for, by, or about Americans. Indeed, in his narrative of peaceful return from Bethlehem through Jerusalem to Nazareth, Luke would have no room for such horrendous events of a slaughter of the innocents and such a detour into Egypt, would he? It just doesn't work in his theological narrative. In Matthew's account, there is no reference to a census, and the whole atmosphere of the story is much different than Luke's.